So yeah, welcome to our today's webinar, topic consent manager and IAB TCF, how to use it, what it is, how to use it, how to set up in your consent manager account. We'll walk you through the a bit to the background and a bit to the how to do the setup, etc. At the end, we will do some some practical things, how you can use it in your website. And then if we have some further time, we can go through some questions. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or Q&A system here in Zoom. You can expand the chat there and just paste your questions there. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to us after the webinar. We will record the webinar and put it on our website. We will also publish the slides here, the PDF version of it, on our website. So if you want to look, have a look at it later, then you can do it on our website. Okay, let's get in there. Consent manager, IAB TCF. Let's start with the background. What's the IAB TCF? Basically, where it came from, before GDPR, yeah, everything was normal. You had a website, there was some advertising on it, everything was fine. Then in 2015, 16, 17, and then 18, finally, the GDPR came into force. So before this happened, the advertising industry saw, yeah, sure, there is something coming. The GDPR is coming. What may happen is, if we all do it, in a compliant way, then it can mean that if you click on reject, that no advertising is displayed, and that's let's say not good for the advertising industry. So you would have the website and no advertising, and if we earn our money from advertising, then that's not a good thing. So the idea was to create a framework, that's the TCF, to allow advertisers to understand the choices of the users in order to have GDPR in place, but still show advertising. The idea behind it is that rejection, so saying no to a cookie banner, doesn't mean that you reject advertising or that the advertising should be removed from the page. It just means there should not be data processing, marketing, analytics, and this kind of stuff. So the TCF basically is there in order to fill the gap between the yes and the no, so that the advertisers can still do advertising, but in the limited fashion. So that's where it came from. In general, what IAB and TCF is, basically IAB is the Interactive Advertising Bureau. So that's the business association of the advertising industry. It basically defines standards and ad formats and video formats and this kind of stuff. It's also known for this real-time bidding format, and lastly for the GDPR format. So that's the TCF. Thereby the IAB Tech Lab, that's basically a subgroup or subsidiary of the IAB, is defining the technical standards, and the local IABs will define the policies. GDPR is a European thing. The IAB is mainly an American, so an US-driven association. So the policies for the TCF, for the GDPR, or how to use the GDPR and how to use the TCF with the GDPR, is mainly coming from the IAB Europe, and therefore from the local IABs. That's, for example, in our case, we are in Sweden. That's IAB Sweden, or for example, in Germany, that's not IAB, that's BVDW. So the country-specific business associations. As said, the IAB creates these standards. One of these standards is the TCF. TCF stands for Transparency and Consent Framework. It's basically a collection of standards, different types of standards. Mainly, it's about sending signals from and to a CMP. That's the consent layer or the consent provider. CMP stands for Consent Management Platform. So from this from the one who collects the consent data to the publisher and the vendors. So sending the information back and forth so that everybody in the chain or on the website can potentially understand what the choice is or was what the user made. There was a first standard in 2018, basically when GDPR came into force. There was a first standard. The first standard was not, let's say, not fully optimal. So there was a quick shot. It worked, but it had some features or left or some gaps there. Since this year, there is TCF version 2. That's now the only standard. So version 1 has been removed, and version 2 is now the one that we need. This standard, offers much more flexibility, much more features, etc. The TCF, when we're talking about TCF, then basically we mean TCF version 2 as a standard. The TCF includes, on the one hand, the policies, so that that's basically the rules that everybody needs to follow if they want to use or interact or participate in this standard. So these rules apply for vendors, publishers, and CMPs. So even you as a publisher, these rules could apply. If you don't follow these rules, then you could be excluded from the TCF, so from using it. Then, besides the policy, there's some technical specifications. One is for the consent string or TC string, and we'll go to this a bit later. The CMP API, so that's what we do. The consent manager is doing. Then there's a global vendor list. That's also some stuff where it's defined which vendors have which IDs, etc. We'll also go through it later. And some more definitions are made there. And so that's the technical framework or the technical stuff in order to that everybody can use. It's free. It's so to say open source. Everybody can use it for their purposes when dealing with the TCF. CMPs, so for example, the consent manager, need to go through a validation process. So we need to prove to the IAB that our software follows these standards, and we use all the guidelines, etc. There will also be a validation for vendors and publishers. It's not yet in place, but it will come, so that the IAB will also then check if vendors and publishers adhere to the policy. As said, if policy is not, so if a CMP, for example, is not policy compliant, then basically it can be excluded, and therefore the CMP can no longer work with the TCF, for example. So that's a bit of a background. For whom is the TCF, and who doesn't really need to use it or is not really made for them? Basically, the simple answer is, if you're doing something with advertising, then TCF is probably your thing. If you're not doing any advertising, then TCF is probably not for you. So on a website or on a website level, so if you have a newspaper, magazines, blogs, this kind of stuff, so you finance yourself or your company is financing mainly through advertising on your website, then TCF is probably very important for you. If you're a vendor, then if you're in the advertising industry or analytics or data industry, then advertising is probably also TCF is probably also important. On the other hand, if you an online shop or a company website or a private website or something like this, then the TCF is probably not important at all, because there's no use case for you. Same if you're a vendor and you create payment software or chat software, email software, whatever. So everything that's not related to advertising, then you also probably don't need to have a look at the TCF. Also very important, the TCF compliance with the TCF does not automatically mean that you are also GDPR compliant. So and vice versa. So there is an overlap. I mean, if you can have both, so you can be GDPR compliant and you can be TCF compliant at the same time. But being GDPR compliant doesn't mean that you're automatically TCF compliant, and being TCF compliant doesn't mean that you're GDPR compliant. So there is rules in the TCF that only apply to the TCF, that so to say are a bit more strict than the GDPR. And on the other hand, there is rules that are in GDPR but not in the TCF, and therefore if you don't apply them, you're not GDPR compliant, but maybe TCF compliant. So there's, as I said, there is an overlap, but it's not the same, so to say. Then some important keywords that will help you understand the TCF a bit better. The TCF defines purposes. That's simply what it is. It's a purpose of data processing. Then they have some special purposes. Special purposes are very basic data processing functions, and TCF makes a distinction here in order to change the legal basis. So, for example, special purposes rely only on legitimate interest and cannot be revoked, where the normal purposes can, they need consent or legitimate interest, one of the both, and can be revoked, etc. Features is a data processing that is across several purposes, and special features are features then that where the IAB felt that these data processing is too, let's say, sensitive for the user, and therefore these special features require an extra consent. Then we have stacks. Stacks are simply just a group of purposes. We have the GVL, that's the global vendor list. It contains the information about all the vendors that register with the IAB. Then every vendor gets an ID, and some details about the vendor is in there. Then there is this OOB, or out of band. That's if a vendor wants to signal consent through a different way than the TCF, then this can so there can be a signal that there is another signal, basically. For example, a contract, if the vendor has a contract with the user or something, then out of band can be used for this. It's a very edgy case. It's very special, just so that you have heard about it. And also TCF version 2 specifies publisher restrictions, or offers publisher restrictions, which basically allows the publisher to restrict the use of purposes and the use of vendors, or how vendors use purposes on their website. For example, a publisher could say, yes, you can do everything on my website, but no personalization, for example. But we will also go through this a bit later then. So that's the keywords. Regarding the purposes and special purposes, in TCF version 1, they had 5 purposes. In TCF version 2, they have now 10 purposes and 2 special purposes. Basically, a purpose, I mean, on most websites, you see purpose like marketing, analytics, personalization, function or something. The TCF is very, so the purposes are very, advertising specific, let's say it this way. And the texts or the names of the purposes are, let's say, in legal writing. So create personalized ads profile, select basic ads, select personalized ads. So usually we would understand, okay, that's marketing, but they're a bit more granular and a bit more, let's say, in legal language. Purpose 1, that's basically so store and or access information on a device. That's basically in normal speak, that's setting cookies. And the other purposes are mainly marketing, content marketing, and measurement. And then we have some, as I said, special purposes. That's like basic delivery, so basic the technical delivery of ads and the fraud prevention, stuff like this. So that's something that you will inform your users, but where you don't give consent, or where you don't expect consent from the users, you just do it. Then on the other hand, there's features. As I said, features is a data processing that's that could span across multiple purposes. For example, match and combine offline data sources. So when you combine data sources online and offline, etc. Linking different devices. Receive and use automatically sent device characteristics for identification. Fingerprinting is the name for this. Then we have the special features. As said, these require extra consent because they are too special in this sense. So precise geolocation, for example, precise in this case means I think 500 meters. So really precise. It means data about usually from GPS devices. So that's not the normal IP geo targeting thingy where you just target a country or a region. That's not there. And the other thing is actively scan device characteristics. So that's active fingerprinting. So where you basically scan the device in order to create a fingerprint. So these things, the IAB felt that they are a bit more sensitive and therefore they need an extra consent. Then we have this TC string. So that's the exchange format, basically. So the CMP will create this from the choices that the user made. It's a bit encoded, base64 encoded. That's for the developers. It's basically a letter salad. So it's just a bunch of letters. It always starts with a C. A C is for version 2. If you see something that doesn't start with a C, version 1 had a B at the start. There's no others. So if you see something that doesn't start with a B or a C, then that's not a TC string. If you see something with a B, then it's an old one. There's also pages where you can basically take this data and put it in, and you see what they decode it, and then you can show you what's happening there. In basic, it contains all the information that's necessary for the vendors to understand what the choice of the user is. So some versions, the dates where it was created and changed, which CMP did it, which language was used, some more versions, which special features were opted in, which purposes were consented to or legitimate interest was established. Same for vendors and, for example, publisher restrictions and a bit more other stuff that's not named here. Important to say there's no combinations of vendors and purposes. So it always says, okay, so basically the user chooses to activate or to give consent to vendors, and the user gives consent to purposes. So the user will say, okay, Google can do stuff and Facebook can do stuff and whatever, Amazon can do stuff. And on the other hand, the user will say, okay, personalization is okay and cookies is okay. The user will not say Amazon may do personalization, but not cookies, and Facebook may do cookies, but not personalization. So it's two separate choices that the user will do, or two separate groups of choices, basically. So that's the vendor or TCF format. Then there is minimum requirements that the TCF requires for each CMP, and therefore for the consent layer. The most important, there's more to it, but the most important, on the first layer, there needs to be a lot of information. So, for example, information about the cookies, device access, third parties, examples of data processing, how to revoke the stuff, etc. The purposes, features, special features, and/or stacks need to be named on the first layer in the writing that the TCF gives. So, for example, if you just go back here, these names of the features, you may not change them. If you're using these purposes, or if you want to allow your vendors to use these purposes, then the first layer needs to exactly say select personalized ads. You may not use marketing or analytics or this kind of stuff. You can add own purposes, but or own features and own groups, but you must use in minimum the writing and the naming of the TCF. You need to have two equivalent choices, meaning usually that's an accept button. Two choices. The one needs to be a button, minimum one. The other one can be a link. It just needs to be 2 choices. And there is, for example, something like a color contrast, a minimum of 5:1. So, for example, if you have a button that's gray and white text on it, that's probably the contrast between the button and the text is probably not 5:1. So you might need to increase the contrast. So make it maybe a black button on white text or something. So there is minimum requirements for the first layer. There's some other requirements for the second layer, you need to have the descriptions in there, descriptions of the purposes. So there's texts, predefined text from the IAB that you need to use. You need to have all the vendors and all the purposes. You need to have the details for these vendors. The legal basis need to be named, etc., etc. So a lot of details that you need to put in the second layer. And you need to have a possibility for granular choice. So it's not possible that the user can only say not marketing, personalization, yes or no. There must be a possibility for granular choice per vendor and per purpose. No requirement, or something that the TCF doesn't require, is all the design stuff, basically, except for this contrast thingies. So you can use whatever colors, whatever paddings, borders, positions, fonts, whatever you want to do. You could put your logo in there. Doesn't matter. It's not defined by the TCF. You can, as said, use one button is sufficient. The other option can be a link, as long as the link is in the same importance, let's say it this way, as the button. So you cannot have a big OK button and a small reject button, reject link. If you have a button and a link, then both need to have, for example, the same font size. You cannot make the one bold and the other one cursive or something. So they both need to be equivalent. And models like pay or advertising, for example, where you see a cookie wall and you can choose, okay, either accept all the cookies or pay for the access. That's okay, or that's allowed by the TCF, for example. Again, as said, these are some things that in some cases are a bit stricter than what GDPR requires. In some cases, for example, this one button thingy, it's less strict than the TCF requires, than the GDPR requires. And the main issue for this, for the difference between TCF and GDPR, is basically that the TCF is kind of the, let's say, the minimum requirement from all the GDPR countries. And especially when it comes to GDPR and e-privacy, a lot of rules are not yet clear. So there's a lot of gray area in GDPR where basically ECG rulings are missing. And so the countries have different opinions on certain things. And that's why TCF kind of takes the minimum requirement in there, not the maximum requirement. So at the end, if you design a layer, you need to have a lot of things. The TCF or the IAB is checking these things. There's a compliance, there's a CMP validator that we as a CMP need to run through. We also need to disable you or your CMP or the TCF features if some of the features are not, or some of these requirements are not fulfilled. So pay attention that you have these. But we will also go through this, what it means in a practical sense, a bit later. Yeah, how to use the consent manager and TCF. So basically what you need to do in our system, you log into your account. When you first create a CMP, then the wizard will ask you basically for a name and for which kind of purposes you want to use. If you want to use the TCF, then you just choose the TCF purposes. Or if you already created a CMP, then you just go into the system, edit your CMP. There's a box called Other Settings. It's right at the bottom there. Expand the box. There's a setting to enable IAB TCF. Once this is done, you will find an IAB icon under all the CMP names and design names. So in the CMP list and the design list, under each name, you will find an icon. You will also find some icons in the vendor list next to the vendors, like this here. along with the vendor ID. In some cases, that's necessary for your targeting in your ad server, for example. And for IAB vendors, in your vendor list, they will also automatically be assigned to the purposes. You will also then find the IAB purposes automatically in your purpose list. You just need to enable them. So the purposes that you want to use. You don't need to adjust your CMP codes or anything else. The codes that you already have in your website will stay the same. You don't need to do anything with them. So first step is you activate them. Second step is you will need to activate the purposes. So you just go to purposes. You will see the 10 or 12, so the 10 purposes and 2 special purposes. You just go in and activate the ones that you want to use. If you're using more than one purpose, which is recommended, then you can use stacks. A stack, as said, is a group of purposes which will replace the purposes that are included in the stack on the first layer. So, for example, the configuration that's shown here and on the right side is purpose 1, 2, 3, 4, and 7. That's basically for advertising the purposes. That means without the stacks, I will have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 checkboxes on the first layer. It can, I mean, 5 is maybe that's something is okay, let's say it this way. But what happens if I enable all the 10 or even the special purpose and I have 12 checkboxes? That might be a bit much. And that's where the stacks come into play. So you would scroll down below the purposes list, there's the stacks list. The system will recommend stacks to you that you could use in order to replace the purposes. And what I did here is, I think it was, I don't know, stack 8 or something. Basically, the stack will then replace the purposes that are in the stacks. And on the first screen, you will only see the stack instead of these purposes. And therefore, the first screen will get a bit, the overview of the first screen will be easier. The purpose 1, that's the cookie purpose, is not included in any of the stacks. So this purpose will always remain on the first layer. There is basically more or less a combination. There's 42 stacks that basically covers all the, let's say, logical combinations or the practical combinations, let's say it this way. So you, in most cases, you will find one single stack that replaces all of your purposes that you want to use. If you're using the special purposes, then there is a second stack for these. So then you will have you will end up with 3 checkboxes on your layer. So that's kind of okay-ish. If you go to the second layer, so if you click on custom choices, if you go to a second layer, the second layer will still show all the purposes so that the user can make granular choices. What you can always do is you can add your own purposes, so you can create custom purposes, add them to it, but you cannot replace the TCF purposes. So, for example, if you want to have something like functional or I don't know, social media or something like this, then you just create an extra custom purpose and add this to the existing TCF purposes. So that's this topic. TCF compliant settings. As said, if you activate TCF, then this logo will appear under the CMP name, and the same as under the design name. It will show you if the settings are okay or not okay. You can click on the icon in order to get more details. It basically will tell you what's wrong there. The important settings is, I mean, on the one hand, TCF need to be enabled. You may only use designs that are set, that are compliant. If you use a non-compliant design in your CMP settings, then the CMP will also lose the compliance. There is a setting that allows you to hide purposes on the first screen. If you enable this purpose, then you will also lose the compliance, and you need to at least use one IAB purpose. If you don't use an IAB purpose, compliance will be removed. With the design settings, again, same thing. If you move the purposes, so basically in the design settings, you can override the CMP settings on some occasions. If you say in the design you don't want to show purpose on the first screen, again, the design will lose the the compliance. Behavior, if you set the behavior, there's automatic behaviors that you can set, you will lose the compliance. If you change the contrast ratio below a value of 5:1, you will lose compliance. And things like if you have, let's say you have two buttons in design, and you make the one button super big and the other button super small, then the system will say, okay, it's not equal, and therefore you will also lose the compliance, for example. Also, what we will do in the future is we will check the texts. So if you're using TCF, you will not be able to change the texts by yourself. So you can change them, you can press save, but then it will basically go to our support people so that they can verify that the text that you inserted is still TCF compliant. And then they will basically confirm the text, and only then it can be used. So that's the compliance settings. That's the settings that you should pay focus on. And at the end, on this icon, as I said, just click on the icon. It will tell you what's wrong there. Yeah, last thing, how to use the TCF, a bit more practical. On the one hand, what's happening on the website, just to get a picture there. So what you will do is, I mean, you take the CMP code, put it in your page as usual. In best case, you will put it directly in the page and as far on top in the page as possible, so the CMP can start loading before all the advertising. What the CMP code does is the code includes a JavaScript function __ TCF API, which will provide the API or the logic for the vendors. Vendors can automatically see if this function is there, so they can check it, and if it's there, they can start sending requests to this API. Once the CMP is loaded, it will take the data from the API, process it, execute the data, execute the functions, and send back the data to the vendor. And then in the last step, the vendor can take the data that they just got from the CMP, evaluate it, and understand what the choice is, and can use it in order to make their own choices. So the vendor can then know, okay, am I allowed to set cookies? Am I allowed to do personalized advertising or analytics or whatever? So the vendor can read what's allowed and what not, and can behave to it. In this case, let's say it this way: the vendor should behave to it. Part of the policy is that the vendors may only take part of the policy if they behave according to the policy, and respect the choices of the users. In real life, let's say it's not yet. Not all vendors yet do it. So if you want to be sure, like compliant, sure, GDPR compliant, then you might want to double check your vendors. So still to the day, I mean, TCF version 1 is out for, what is it now, 2 years or something. Still to the day, we see a lot of vendors still setting cookies, although no consent is given. So it's no guarantee, let's say it this way. So that's how it works. The other thing many clients struggle about, or what's important for them, is how to use the IAB TCF and Google Ads. So what will happen is, as soon as a CMP is in your page, is active and in your page, Google will recognize this. Same logic as we just described. So Google will see, there is a CMP, it offers the TCF API. Google will ask the CMP and will stop delivering ads without consent. So if the CMP is in your page, consent is required. Consent meaning the user clicked on accept or enabled it on the other way, and enabled it and press saved or something. If the user did not enable certain feature purposes, or the vendor Google, or clicked on reject, Google will not deliver any ads. So the ad spaces will just remain empty. There is some requirements that Google wants to have. The one is, obviously, it needs to be TCF compliant. You need to have a certain vendor in your vendor list. It's called Google Advertising Products. It has this ID 755. Be aware that there is several vendors with the name Google in our system, like Google Analytics, Google Maps, Google ReCAPTCHA, etc. There's also a Google Ads and there is a Google advertising products. You need the Google advertising products. So make sure you have this vendor in your vendor list. Make sure you have the purpose 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 9, and 10 activated. And in your CMP settings, disable the consent scope, or don't set it to global consent scope, and don't activate OOB. Usually that's not activated, but just as an extra, don't activate it. If you have it in a page, as said, Google will not show ads. There is some errors or some issues. If you have an issue in your setting, in some cases Google will still deliver ads. So if the CMP configuration is not 100% accurate, let's say it this way, in some cases Google will still show ads. There's a transition phase until 2021. Mid-January is the current date. Let's say this way, the transition period was extended, I think 2 or 3 times now. Let's see if it's really happening in mid-January. But as a precaution, you should have your settings ready. Also important to note, a CMP doesn't change practically anything. Even without a CMP, you are obliged by Google to have consent before showing ads. So currently it is, if you remove the CMP from your page, Google will show ads. If you put a CMP in your page, Google might stop showing ads if no consent is given. So you could argue that let's not take a CMP. The Google policy that you signed up for tells you to only put the Google codes in the page if consent is given. The only difference with the CMP is that Google now can understand automatically if consent is given. So if you put the code in the page without a CMP, Google just assumes that you asked the user before, and that's why the codes are in the page. So without the CMP, if you don't have a CMP, put the codes in the page and no consent is given, you're basically violating Google's rules. Also important, Google gives you a list of errors. You can find it in your Google Ad Manager, Google AdSense, and these various Google products. The list of errors contains I think 6 or 7 groups. So 1 to 1.x, 2.x, etc. The most errors that you will see is 1.x. They basically mean that no consent is given. So the headline errors is a bit, not optimal, let's say it this way. You can basically ignore them. If you see the other errors, you will see some of them, they should be below 1%. Everything below 1% should be fine. If you see more than 1%, then check the errors. There's a description to it on this Google page, so that you understand what can be the cause of it. In most cases, it's some configuration issue. In addition to this whole thing, these TCF support from Google is for all Google advertising products. That's why the name is Google Advertising Products, meaning it includes Google Ad Manager, it includes Google AdSense, the Google AdX, and Google 360, for example. So that's about Google. The pay or advertising model, as said, it's in principle allowed by the TCF. The screenshot here is Spiegel, German what is it, magazine, newspaper thingy. It's in principle allowed by the TCF, but it has the same requirements as all the other websites need to go through. The only difference is basically you don't need to have the reject button, but you can just use a pay button or something. But still, you need to have the same requirements with text. You need to name the purposes. You need to have all the same stuff. You also need to have a custom settings. That's here the privacy center in their case. And the difference, or the only difference there is, so the privacy center still needs to show all the vendors, all the purposes, etc., with the legal names or with the IB names and the descriptions, etc. It does not need to show consent toggles, so checkboxes or toggle something, so that you can consent or unconsent from a vendor or a purpose. but it needs to show legitimate interest toggles if legitimate interest is used as a legal basis for any of these vendors or purposes. As said, purpose number 1 is not allowed to be used with legitimate interest by the IAB, and therefore in most cases consent is anyway required. So basically the poor model, or in Germany we call it poor model, pay or advertising, is a good way for you to increase acceptance, because they need to accept, otherwise they can't access the page, and the ones who don't want to have the advertising can still pay. I said it's allowed by the TCF, but you need to keep in mind some DPAs, or the local authorities, might not like it. So the Lower Saxony in Germany, the authorities, they just recently had a what is it? A text or a paper saying they see this model as a potential alternative. So they think it's okay, but other authorities might not look at it in the same way. If you want to use it, there is in design settings, there is a box custom HTML where you can basically insert the HTML or the text or stuff that you want to use on the on the second side. So basically this part where it comes to consent and the buttons and the preference set, etc., will come from the CMP, and you will just design the other side and the payment stuff. We are also currently preparing a cooperation with a payment vendor. They will basically do this, the second side here. The cooperation is planned for Q1 2021. So quite soon, basically. And the idea there is that you can just sign up with them, insert an ID somewhere in our system, maybe design something, and then you don't need to do all this, the technical integration and the back and forth with the HTML. So that's about to come there. So that's this model, and a last look on TCF and legitimate interest, and with this the publisher restrictions. So legitimate interest is one of the 6 legal bases in GDPR. TCF, due to, let's say, practical reasons, only supports consent and legitimate interest. So the 4 other legal bases are not really, they don't really make sense in the internet, let's say it this way. So legitimate interest or consent is the one thing. Consent is basically, I have an empty checkbox, I tick the checkbox and press the save button, that's consent. A legitimate interest is usually defined as an opt-out, so the checkbox is predefined, and I need to remove the tick from the checkbox. If I don't opt out from it, then a legitimate interest will continue to process data, while consent, I expressively need to click accept and in order to get into the data processing. If a vendor wants to process or wants to use one of the two legal bases, basically what the vendor is doing, they register with the IAB. With their registration, they say which legal basis they use and which purposes they use, which legal basis they use for which purpose. So they can go in there and they have a little interface and just say, okay, we want to do personalized advertising or personalized or measure performance or whatever, and then they can say which legal basis they use, and they can mark the legal basis as flexible, meaning they can process the data for this purpose either on consent or on legitimate interest. Because this can cause legal issues, the publisher is allowed to override it. So there's this publisher restrictions, and the publisher can basically say, okay, you are flexible. You say you vendor, you wanna do data processing based on, let's say, legitimate interest, but on my side, please only do it based on consent. So basically, or they can change the legal basis. This can create 2 problems or 3 problems. The one thing is, if I, as a vendor, override the legal basis of if I as a publisher override the legal basis of a vendor, then this can mean if the vendor is not flexible, this means the vendor may not use this purpose at all. So if you want to use it, you can go into the account settings, you can go to the purposes and to the vendors, and for each vendor you will see a link saying a standard default or a standard legal basis or something like this, and then you just click on the link and change it to either consent or legitimate interest. If you do it like this, then the vendor can only process data based on consent or legitimate interest, not on the other way. As said, if the vendor is not it did not declare itself as flexible, then the vendor may not process the personal data for this purpose at all. So that you can run into, let's say, unexpected issues there, that vendors don't want to process anything. Also, if you use publisher restrictions, so if you tell their vendors what to do, it massively increases the cookie size. So the TC string that's created will then include more information, and this more information is, let's say, not stored in an optimal way. So the consent string will get bigger and bigger. And the problem there is that especially the Safari browser has a maximum of 4 kilobytes for cookies. That's all cookies from the same domain together. So if you have one cookie or many cookies that together exceed this 4 kilobytes, then the Safari browser will stop serving the website. So you can put in, if you put in the URL in your browser and you press enter, the page will remain empty. That's an issue because on the one hand, the publisher will not even realize. So the publisher, I mean, the users will not end up on your website. So the publisher will not see that there is a user having trouble. You will just see, if you look at your numbers, you will see, oh wait, no Safari users anymore on my page. So it can create troubles. Usually the TC string is way below 4 kilobytes. So the normal TC string is like 300, 400 kilobytes, maybe 800 if you have lots of vendors. But as said, if you use publisher restrictions, the TC string can increase drastically. We had a client that created a TC, or settings that created a TC string of 12 kilobytes. And with 12 kilobytes, that's not only the Safari that has issues, but also other browsers. So it can really create a massive issue. Also, with this, you always need to remind legal basis, or especially legitimate interest, is kind of an edge case. It's really only practically used in certain cases. For example, if the user, let's say, if the user clicks on accept, then it doesn't really matter if consent or legitimate interest is used. Same if the user clicks on reject all, then also our system will reject consent and revoke a legitimate interest. And therefore also no data processing can happen. So it doesn't make sense in these two cases to tell the vendor that he should possess personal data based on a certain legal basis. Same if the user goes into custom settings, all settings that the user is doing will have the same value for consent and legitimate interest. So again, it doesn't make a difference if you want to override the vendor. The only practical situation is basically if the user is changing purposes on the first layer. So if you see the checkboxes on the first layer and the user enables or disables a certain purpose and clicks on save, that's the only case when legitimate interest really makes a practical difference, because then legitimate interest is on for all purposes, but off for the purposes where you remove the tick from the checkbox. So that's really the only case. So in normal scenario, we would recommend not to change the legal basis, not to use publisher restrictions due to this issue with cookie size and possible objection of vendors and legal basis. Yeah, so that's the overview on TCF. I hope you learned something. Don't forget to check our help page if you have any questions, help.consentmanager.net. Feel free to recommend us. If you have any questions, reach out to us at support@consentmanager.net. Visit our website, www.consentmanager.net, and register for a free demo account on the right top corner of the website. And thank you for listening. So let's stop the recording at this moment.